Probably one of the most exciting features to talk about that we have at Veeam is known as the Data Lab. For those of you who have been around for a few years, you may also remember this used to be called the Virtual Lab. It's the exact same concept, simply rebranded now with the Data Lab because we have the ability to leverage data in so many more ways. And that's one of the things I wanted to talk with you guys today about is A, what is the Data Lab? How does it operate? And B, what features has Veeam released that can actually leverage this data lab? So the first thing we need to do is draw out a basic VMware environment so that we can illustrate exactly the key components that make up the data lab, how it communicates from a networking standpoint, and then what options we have once that data lab is deployed. So bear with me just a moment while we draw out a nice simple VMware environment. Okay, now that we've got our VMware environment laid out, let's review exactly what we've got. So essentially, you've got a simple diagram. We've got 3 virtual machines running on an ESXi host connected to our SAN. We've got our production network illustrated here with this switch diagram, and we're drawing this connection, meaning that the VMs that are running on the host communicate with the actual physical network through the I/O stack of the host, going out to the physical switching, and then the physical switching is what connects out to the actual internet or the WAN or the MPLS or any other type of connection outside of your main location. Now down at the bottom, we've got drawn out a couple components. You notice there's 2 storage depictions here. One of them we've already talked about as the SAN. The other is a Veeam repository. Now, let's also assume that the SAN that we're talking about is a 3-par, okay? Now, the only reason I mention this is, and you know that we integrate with quite a few SAN vendors, so literally plug and play whichever SAN vendor you like as long as Veeam has built the integration. And the reason I wanted to do this is we can actually leverage the storage snapshots or the backup repository using backup files to actually power the data lab. Now, you may be asking, what is the data lab? Where does it live? How does it work? So now that we have the basics drawn out from a VMware standpoint, let's start filling in the missing pieces on what the data lab actually is and where those pieces fall. Now I'm going to draw this out in a different color so we can easily compare and contrast the two, and I'll be back with you guys in just a second. Okay, we're back. So let me try to illustrate what we've added to this diagram. So to understand how the actual data lab works, it's important to understand the pieces that we have in play. The first and foremost piece that really makes the magic happen is this Proxy Appliance. Now, the Proxy Appliance that we've got drawn right here is simply a virtual machine. It's a very, very lightweight VM. It's essentially a hardened Linux kernel VM that runs IP tables to handle all the routing. There's certain ports that are open that only Veeam, needs for our communication purposes. Now, certainly, if you're a Linux guru, you can log on, you can modify the IP table schematics, but by default, the ports that Veeam needs to communicate are open. And really, the only thing we're using this Proxy Appliance for is a virtual router. Now, it's important to understand how the Proxy Appliance works. So if we come over here a bit so we have a little bit more room, let's say this is the Proxy Appliance. Okay, let's say this is essentially the isolated network on this side, and this is the production network on this side. The proxy actually has a leg into production and the isolated environment. So the way that we do this is with virtual network adapters. So effectively, when you go and create your Proxy Appliance as part of your data lab, you can add as many VNICs as the VM can handle on the VMware side if you have that many different networks. That way, a single Proxy Appliance that runs a data lab can actually route traffic across multiple different networks. Same thing applies for VLANs. If you have different VLANs in play, you can specify those different VLAN tags when you're setting up your Proxy Appliance for the data lab. Now, it's important to remember that when this first came out, and it was a virtual lab concept a couple years back, the idea was this entire isolated environment was designed for a sandbox only. It was not designed or originally intended to allow migration of VMs running in the virtual lab back into production. So in other words, if you were doing something like sure backup verification testing, we're going to turn on the VMs, we're going to do our checks, and when we're done, we're discarding changes and turning everything off. Same thing was true with the on-demand sandbox functionality that we've had for many years. You would do a test, you would do a patch, do a software upgrade in the data lab, or back then the virtual lab, make sure that it worked, and then as soon as you verified it worked, you would power it off and then redeploy or remake those changes in production with the confidence that you have tested it first. Now, there were certain ways that you could kind of backdoor that into production, doing manual storage vMotions, getting the VM back into production. The problem was this was not supported. It was not the intended purpose. Now, fast forward to today, we actually do have that as part of the supported platform, is migration back into production. And that's where some of the new capabilities come in, and we'll talk about those in just a moment. But to finish talking about how it works, so we've got the isolated network. Now, you see depicted right here is an isolated network, and you'll see this in vSphere. It'll be a vSwitch. You'll actually have that, and you label the name when you're deploying the virtual lab. But the key is there won't be any uplinks. So this is going to be an isolated network just for testing. And this is the way historically this has worked, throughout the history of the virtual lab. And by this design, anything that is powered on inside this isolated network can only communicate with the proxy appliance. So remember, we talked about over here, the proxy appliance has a leg on both sides. So it's essentially straddling the fence. It can communicate with production because it has an actual real IP in the production network, but it also has a leg in that isolated network where it also has an IP on that side. Now, typically what you see is in the isolated network, it poses as the default gateway. So it acts like the traditional gateway that would be up here in production, so that when you have a VM that was statically set, such as a statically set gateway IP, it's actually going to hit this proxy appliance, not the production network, right? And then that proxy does the routing. Again, that's what we talked about. The proxy appliance acts like a virtual router. Now, the way that it's designed to work is twofold. You can either drive this data lab from a backup in your Veeam repository, or if you have a supported SAN vendor that we've built integration with, you can also power it with storage snapshots. Now, what will happen, let's take the traditional method, the typical backup file that we've had for several years. So what happens, I've drawn this, you can see, follow this line here. What will essentially happen is the Veeam backup and replication server, because it knows and it has access to the Veeam backup files living on the repository, it will present that backup file as a NFS data store inside vSphere. So if you look at it strictly on the vSphere side, you see what looks like an NFS data store. But on the back end, the backup file, which is sitting down here in the repository, is still compressed and deduplicated. So this is where really the magic happens, and we've had this technology for years. Won Best of Show when it first came out at VMworld, and it basically gives Veeam that ability to bridge the gap and stream that VM while it's still deduped and compressed. So this circumvents any delays on the rehydration penalties and the decompression times. Now, if you've got a vPower NFS server selected other than the repository server, whatever machine that you dedicate as the vPower NFS server when you set up your repository is what is going to make that NFS connection, right? Now, by default, it's the Veeam server. But if you have another machine that you're allowing to handle that NFS mount, you can easily specify that when you're adding your repository into Veeam. Now, pros and cons of this method. I would say a pro is it's the easiest way. It's been around for years. It's simple to really set up. There's just a couple clicks. You add your repository, and that's about all you need to do as far as the ability to use a backup to power the data lab. Now, the data lab itself does take some configuration and deployment, which we'll cover in another video. But as far as getting ready to use a backup file to drive the data lab, very simple. Now, a con here would be, remember, it's deduped and compressed. So you've got performance penalties. You've got a deduped file, you've got a compressed file, which by design is going to have some performance challenges. On top of that, this repository likely isn't as fast as your 3PAR, right? Normally with a backup repository, you're going for cheap and deep, very dense storage. So the IO capability is not going to be anywhere near as good as a production storage array or a SAN like a 3PAR, okay? So pros and cons. When you look at the storage snapshots, quite frankly, I don't see any cons. Like if you have a supported SAN vendor like an HPE 3PAR, absolutely driving this from a SAN snapshot is going to run circles around the backup file method as far as performance goes, because essentially you now have production level performance coming right from your production array. So you won't incur any of those performance penalties coming from the backup file. Now, that's how all this works conceptually. So you've got the data lab. Let's summarize. It's a completely isolated environment. It's kept isolated by this proxy appliance that serves as a gatekeeper. So think about it like a virtual router. It handles all the routing inside the data lab, as well as communicates with Veeam in the outside world on that production network. Now, there's a couple really nice things you can do with that proxy appliance. You can set up static routes. And static routes are very, very convenient if you want to set up a situation where, let's say you've got some SQL DBAs and you want to spin up a few of their SQL servers and allow them to play around, do some testing, write some custom scripts, do some queries, whatever they want to do to modify their databases. But you don't necessarily want them to do that live in production. You can spin up the data lab, set up a static route for those SQL machines that are going to be running in the data lab, and simply give those DBAs those IP addresses, and they can actually RDP in right from their local workstation as long as they're on this LAN, right? That way they can do all their testing and patching and customization with very, very similar copies, because you're coming from either a backup, which is recent, or a storage snapshot, which is very recent in this case. So they're actually able to test with near production data, or very, very close to the actual state of those servers in production, right? Without affecting production, because remember, these instances are in the isolated environment coming from either a backup file or a storage snapshot, both of which can be undone and discard changes. So that's a lot of me talking around how the data lab works. Now, which features does Veeam have that the data lab is needed for? So for starters, we've got Sure Backup. Sure Backup has been around for quite some time, along with its brother, Sure Replica. Now, Sure Backup and Sure Replica are really designed for verification purposes. And like I said, they've been around for quite some time. Sure Backup is the ability to set a job schedule. Remember, these are jobs, okay? So you can actually set up the jobs and run those on a schedule, and you can have this happen every night after the backups, maybe once on the weekend just to do a check. And basically what happens with Sure Backup is it will turn on the VMs from the repository this time, from your backup files, inside the data lab, make sure the VM boots up properly, is responsive to things like ping testing and heartbeat checking. We even do custom application verifications to make sure that certain ports are responding based on the workload, like based on what application is running inside. And then when all that's done, we can power down the VM and provide you a detailed audit trail report so that you have documentation that you're testing those backups for recoverability. Now, the same is true for Sure Replica, except as you might suspect, we're no longer testing backups, we're testing our replicas. So if you know, Veeam does a 2-in-1 product essentially, right? We have backups and we have replicas. Now replicas is a whole nother, video, a whole nother topic, but essentially a replica is a warm copy of the production VM that's powered off, but it's ready to be turned on at a moment's notice. It's very up to date. because you run those replica updates on a job-based schedule once a day, twice a day, every 4 hours, what have you. Sure Replica does the same thing. It's going to turn on the replicas, make sure they boot up, make sure they're responsive, make sure you don't have any hidden issues with the VM that we've created. Same test, ping, heartbeat, application, shut those down, and again, get the audit trail report. So those two are tried and true. They've been around for years. And quite honestly, that's one of the biggest reasons why, if you have any customers that are not on Enterprise or Enterprise Plus, and let's say they're on Standard, this is one of the main reasons to try to drive them to do an upgrade, to jump up to one of those higher level licensing tiers. Now, let's talk about a new one. Staged restore and secure restore. Now, what do you think these are? So let's talk about this. So staged restore is the ability to do almost what it says. So essentially you're doing a recovery in the data lab before you recover directly back into production. And there's a couple different reasons why you would want to do this. One common reason is the right to be forgotten. So when you're talking about GDPR and very sensitive data, and let's say you have something happen in production and you have to go to a backup to do a recovery. Well, something may have happened where the right to be forgotten was invoked. You've cleaned all the data from the production instance, but let's say production now has an issue and you have to go back to a backup file that was a week or two old and you do a restore. If you went directly back into production with that version of said data, it may still contain that sensitive information. So what staged restore allows you to do is essentially make a stop along the way inside the data lab, extract out whatever data needs to be pulled, and then migrate it on into production. And that's one of the things, like I said earlier, that we've been missing for several years is a supported method to do something in the data lab and then migrate it into production. And that's why you're seeing this shift from the virtual lab to the data lab from a verbiage standpoint, because we can leverage data in so many more ways now using this data lab technology that we've had for years, but in more ways, right? In secure restore, what's really cool about this one, this has to do with viruses, ransomware, malware, any type of infection, let's just leave it at that, that could happen with your VMs. So what this can do is before we restore directly back into production, we make a stop along the way and we can actually activate virus scanning software. Now there's a whole list of virus scanners that we support. Windows Defender is built in. I know Nod32 is included, but essentially any virus scanner that you've seen out, there's a whole list of these, and we allow that to be invoked while that restored instance is sitting in the data lab, just to make sure that you're not about to restore a version of your VM that's already infected with malware or spyware or any type of virus information. So that's really cool, because if you went straight back to production with it, you could be setting yourself up for the same scenario. So the last thing you would want to do, especially with something like ransomware, is restore directly back into production where it can infect the rest of your environment. So this is a really nice way to have that stop point in the data lab, make the verifications, let the virus scanner complete and make sure everything's all clear. In the stage restore example, stop off here, extract sensitive data before you restore directly back to production. So guys, hopefully this is useful for you. Data Labs, in my opinion, is one of the most impressive capabilities that Veeam has today, because we can leverage your data in so many ways. And essentially, we've had these two for several years. We've just added two more. So what's next, right? So again, you keep going down the list. There's so many use cases to have this data lab technology. And these are 4 of the ways that we've innovated that enable our customers to leverage this whole isolated framework that we've designed. And again, keep in mind, you don't have to buy extra gear to run the data lab. It's not like you need extra servers, a whole separate test dev environment. You can actually leverage what you already have. And by the way, if we wanted to add OnDemand Sandbox, that's another big one, right? OnDemand Sandbox is doing essentially anything you need in this isolated test environment, run some patches, do some software upgrades, do some, training simulations, whatever you may need to do. That's yet another case for the data lab. So again, the list could continue. We could come up with a few more ways, but again, the video is probably already long enough. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you have any customers on standard, ask them when the last time they tested their backups for true recoverability was. And if they look at you like you've got a third eye in your head, you need to start trying to convince them to upgrade to enterprise, because not only can we do that and spit out documentation that we're doing that, it's automated. They don't have to bring people in over the weekend. This is something you just set up the job schedule and go on about your life, and it does it for you automatically, and you'll get the results as soon as the job finishes. So really great technology. Data Labs is huge, guys. Thanks so much for watching. Enjoy the rest of your day.